All right, let's talk to that person right now who is metabolically unhealthy, overweight. They've tried the classical cut back on calories, move the body more. They're ready to try keto, but we want to not overwhelm them. So, what's the simplest way into this diet? And then let's talk about over that first day, all the way through the first year, and really take our time here and talk about the physiology changes as somebody changes that fuel source.
Sure. So the best way to do this is to think about what are you eating today? Because the best way to help transition someone to a lower carbohydrate indoor ketogenic diet is to find out what they're already consuming that they enjoy that already fits that dietary pattern. Okay. And so maybe they're already eating chicken. Maybe they enjoy that. They're eating eggs. Maybe they like salads. Maybe they like asparagus or broccoli or cauliflower. Okay. Well, we're going to keep all those things, but they were consuming a lot of bread and let's say a lot of sweet potatoes or white potatoes, rice. Well, we're going to remove those. Okay. And then we're going to find out, okay, how much of those forms of foods, starchy, sugary forms of carbohydrates, do they really miss in their diet? Do they really miss rice? Okay, well, let's find a substitute for that that's lower carbohydrate. It may not replicate it entirely, particularly rice. That's a hard one to replicate. But there are things like cauliflower rice. It's not exactly the same, but it gives you an alternative that you can supplement in so you don't feel like you're entirely deplete of the foods you were eating before. If you're thinking about, okay, well, so that's an easy guide at first. Now, for a lot of people, there's amazing tracking tools online that allow them to just input the foods they're consuming, sometimes simply with just pictures, and it will tell them the composition of that diet. Now, what people want to shoot for is green leafy vegetables, a protein source with each food, typically broken down in equal quantities across all meals. So let's say, Jesse, you're 180 pounds, give or take, and you wanted to eat the optimal form of protein for you and you exercise. I would say, okay, you could go up to 180 grams of protein and split that over, let's say, if it's 3 meals, 60 grams per meal. If it's 4 meals, maybe you're obviously less than that. So you'd break it up proportionally, equally across these meals. You would choose a high quality protein source, typically from a whole food source, and that would make up your protein source. Now, if you were to put this into, let's say, Chronometer or MyFitnessPal, this going to tell you the amount of fiber, net carbohydrates in that meal from the fiber vegetables you're consuming, and the protein source. Well, a lot of these protein sources, Jesse, including eggs, salmon, beef, some forms of chicken, like chicken thighs, chicken breasts are very low in fat, or even the dressing that you put onto your salad are probably going to come with fat, natural forms of fat. And as a result, those natural forms of fat are going to make a decent amount of calories in that meal. And you also want to account for those within the diet. But ultimately, you're shooting for more of a ratio of lower carbohydrate, ensuring you're getting adequate protein and allowing the fat to come along for the ride. That's typically a how-to guide in how to implement this in a functional capacity. If you're like an elite low athlete, another level of consideration would be, okay, now you need to actually make sure you're getting sufficient calories. You want to split this up strategically around meals, but we're not going to go into that right now. But for the average person, fibrous carbohydrates, net carbohydrates per meal, probably less than 15 or so. It's good to get that fiber in the diet, in my opinion. And you want to focus on a high quality protein source. Again, trying to get as many whole foods in as you can. And just allowing the fat to come on for the ride. Again, avoiding starchy, sugary carbohydrates or hidden sugars that are often in many foods. So you want to check the back of a label. Sometimes people will pick up some bacon and not realize that a lot of times they add sugar to bacon. They add sugar to beef jerky. They add sugar to peanut butters. And so they do that on purpose because it gives it a higher flavor profile, and then people tend to overconsume them. It also adds more calories. It also reduces the metabolic health of that food, in my opinion. So you have to be conscious of what you're consuming. But if you consume whole foods, you can typically forego a lot of the tricks that food companies will do in packaged foods products. Again, not all companies are trying to trick people, but unfortunately, many do things that may be suboptimal to the food in order for you to overconsume them or consume as much as possible and may not be to your benefit. And that's really making up the diet, okay? Lower carbohydrates, higher protein source, and allowing fat to come along for the ride. Now, what is the metabolic changes that will transpire, let's say at the very first meal? So let's say that you were eating oatmeal in the morning with some egg whites and some fruit, and then your second meal was, let's say, chicken breast with some or like let's say a sandwich, like let's say with some deli meat, and then for dinner maybe you had some chicken with some potatoes and maybe some side greens. All right, well, now how would you switch this around? Let's say you switch to a ketogenic style diet. For the first meal a day, you switched away from the oats and the higher forms of sugary based fruits towards, let's say, you're going to do eggs. You're going to do, you could do some forms of, like, let's say, chia seeds or some other form of high fiber, low carbohydrate quantity form of fiber source that may be applicable for, say, a breastfed style meal. Let's say for that first meal, when you first consume it and it's lower in carbohydrates, maybe you add a little bit of raspberry and blueberries because those are higher fiber content fruits and can be in smaller quantities, let's say a fourth of a cup, applicable in this diet. You consume at the first meal, instantly glucose is going to drop. So the amount of glucose your body is exposed to at that first meal is going to go down. That means the body is now going to sense less glucose in the blood. Once the body senses less glucose in the blood, it's going to detect that in the pancreas, and the pancreas is now going to lower its insulin secretion at the very first meal. Then, over the next hours, up to around hour 18 after that first meal, you're going to see an elevation in something called ketone bodies, which is a byproduct of fat metabolism. What has happened is when the insulin lowers, it removes the blockade on fat breakdown. Insulin is a fat storage hormone, and it actually blocks fat from being broken down to be utilized and metabolized for fuel. So when insulin lowers, it removes this blockade on fat breakdown and allows for your own body fat to now be broken down, taken to the liver, go through fatty acid oxidation, and also goes to other tissues to be starting to utilize as a more predominant form of fuel. And the liver will take that fat and convert some of it to ketone bodies. The reason your body's converting some of that to ketone bodies, and you actually see a noticeable elevation at hour 18 post the first meal of a ketogenic diet, is because the body is starting to replace what was the sugar for brain energy metabolism towards more ketones as a form of brain energy metabolism to ensure your brain always has sufficient amount of energetic substrates. And any combination of glucose, ketones, or lactate, all three of which are readily utilizable by the brain. Now, after hour 18, you're going into the next day to next week. Over this next week, the lower insulin quantity within the body is going to now stop the body from retaining as much sodium and water. Why? Because for every gram of glucose that goes into the cell with insulin, 3 grams of water go in as well. And along with that comes sodium. So when insulin goes lower, you're not going to hold as much water, which is why it's such an effective tool for many people who have high blood pressure, because you're holding less water. So as a result, you're starting to excrete more water. You're starting to hold less sodium over this period of time. And that can last for up to 2 to 4 weeks. At least some evidence suggests that that's the average period of time for some individuals. Now, for that period of time, people are often recommended to supplement with some sodium to help balance out this shift in mineral quantities within the blood, because some people get this concept called the keto flu, where they feel fatigued or tired. Well, one, the body is shifting from its lifelong predominant reliance on fat or carbohydrates as a fuel source towards this new form of fuel as its new predominant form in the form of fat. That will require the body to make some adjustments and shifts. But also, in order to offset what is oftentimes people can experience fatigue or headaches or irritability during this transition, a lot of times, yes, that in part might be due to this major shift the body's going through, but also because you're actually have insufficient amounts of mineral, typically sodium. So it's often recommended to supplement, increase your sodium intake at your meals. And if that is not able to resolve any of these, let's say, issues, if they do arise, to add somewhere between 1 to 3 grams in addition until those issues begin to reside or resolve until you're fully adapted. Okay. But that's typically within the first 7 days. So you're losing weight, typically in the form of water weight. Your glucose is coming down. Your insulin's already coming down. And you're starting to see elevations and sign that your body is now starting to burn more fat. Now, up to the next 2 to 3 weeks, Jesse, your body is going to start progressively shifting to higher levels of fat burning. what we call fat oxidation. And typically within 2 to up to 3 weeks, almost all of that has occurred, at least on measurements during exercise that we've done and other people have done, where the body is shifting towards glucose as its predominant form of fuel, towards ramping up its use of your own endogenous forms or own body fat as its new form of fuel or predominant form of fuel. And by week 2 or 3, your body's really ramped that up almost in its entirety, or at least start to get to a place of normalization with those higher fat burning values. Okay. Now, that's going to last up to week 2 or 3. Even up to the first 2 to 3 weeks, we also know the body's undergoing changes in its perception towards food. Okay. So your reliance on certain forms of food, your dependency, and your kind of like attachment to certain foods in your basically your psychological relationship with some of the foods you consumed and your new psychological relationship, your new diet is starting to transition and transform over that period of time. And we know that around week 4 is when we start to see normalization typically of blood glucose levels. And around just after week 3, ketone levels start to peak and plateau. So we're starting to see the brain energy metabolites begin to hit a level of normalization after the 3-week window. Now, that's why we see at the 4-week window that most athletes who transition to these lower carbohydrate ketogenic diets begin to see normalization of their performance, where what they were doing on a high carbohydrate diet, they have now matched and or are equivalent to on a ketogenic diet. So they're no longer seeing any type of functional decline with a much higher level of fat as their predominant form of fuel or burning during that exercise. And the reliance on fat and ketone bodies as a new form of fuel for many tissues, particularly the brain, is now at a much higher level. Now, there's other changes that extend beyond that. Some of those appear to potentially be renal changes, glycogen changes, and an array of others that maybe have yet to be detected, like specific muscle fiber type changes or receptor changes or otherwise. We don't know all the answers at this point, what happens over this period of time, but we do know that most of the major changes appear to occur within the first 4 weeks, but some do persist for longer. And ultimately, what we're talking about beyond that point is a stabilization of this new style of diet where your body is now mostly burning fat as fuel, both your endogenous or stored fat on your body, but also the fats that you're consuming from your food. And over time, and as this persists for longer, one would expect that most of the enzymatic changes, the molecules in the body that process metabolites and break them down, most of the stable functional forms of fuel and the blood, glucose, ketones begin to normalize. And then we start to see changes up to muscle glycogen that may persist for months. In fact, the only study we know of where the muscle glycogen levels begin to fully normalize is 9 to 36 months in duration in high elite athletes, whereas studies for 3 months or less in duration have largely shown initial drops in muscle glycogen levels that start to be restored over time. So again, some of these changes appear to be very rapid. Most actually are within the first 2 weeks. There's some that last up to 4 weeks, particularly the functional performance-based changes. And then there's some changes that clearly linger for longer than that. And there may be even things beyond that that we don't fully understand. But that's the physiologic and metabolic changes that transition when someone shifts towards the standard higher carbohydrate-based approach to a lower carbohydrate diet where your body is now less reliant on glucose and sugar as a fuel source. Insulin is now lower, and your body has now shifted towards more of a fat and ketone-based metabolism.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
A very low carbohydrate and very high fat diet, known as the ketogenic diet, has been known to have powerful metabolic changes. When people utilize these high carbohydrate diets since the 1970s as the one optimal form of diet, it is